Well, listening to, I was very supportive of what Edward was saying about the challenge and the opportunities ahead of us. If you look at Kent's position, if you take Medway, which is a unitary, we're spending currently about £8.5 billion worth of spend in Kent in terms of public expenditure. That includes central government. And I'll come on to that later, because the question for all of us, I think, is not simply about the strategic intent in relation to infrastructure costs and new ways of thinking about that on the longer term, which I think is what Edward was saying, which I do applaud. But what real challenge do we seriously have now in the public sector overall? And I don't just mean local government, if we're to move on post-election. Because I think we've been playing with words with the public in the last few weeks, and I think we're not, some of us, smelling the coffee when we get post-election phase. So I want to touch one part of the infrastructure before I get into Total Place, and I hope I won't run over, because I think it's so important, and it's only very recently I've felt that that the public sector management and politicians nationally and locally are starting to understand the implications of this. How many in this room are under the age of 24? Right. Oh, well. The rest of us are immigrants to the digital revolution that's taking place. And if I'm frank with you, you know, I have both professional colleagues and politicians who still think broadband is something you wear. And I think it's a serious question for the modernising and the transformation agenda, because if we don't sort out broadband and we don't sort out fast-track broadband, then all of these aspirations that we have about modernising and transforming will not happen, in my judgment, in the public sector. And I include the health service in that. So we know it can't be sustained in its present form, and the issue for me, when I take on the Total Place agenda within Kent, is that we have very much realised over the last decade that ordinary people, citizens out there, are changing their behaviour by the day. We can see that in terms of the current election, what they're going to do. We don't even know what they're up to in this election. But we're all becoming more articulate, more demanding. And there is a sense that I feel that the state, whether we like it or not, in my view, has become too intrusive. And we've created a bit of a culture, and I found that very acutely as Chief Executive in Kent during the winter, where I was trying to get the business community to help us, and then being stopped by the Health and Safety Executive to say this was the state's responsibility to clear snow, not local government. And interesting, if you're in Germany, it's the citizen's obligation to clean snow and business obligation to clean snow, not the state. So there is a sense, I have, that there is something going on here that's cost us a great deal of money, and I'm not sure that the added value is worth it. I don't want to go on about globalisation and Web 2, but it seems to me, I find it interesting that China and Hong Kong at the moment are investing very, very heavily and are talking about a minimum of 100 megabyte to domestic property, and the UK is still talking about 1.5 megabyte to a domestic property. That is ridiculous. We should be thinking much more dramatically, much more strategically about that question, because it has massive implications on reducing our public costs. And I'll tell you why that is. At the moment, if you take the public sector as a whole in the UK, our transactional costs in relation for you to go online and transact for a public service, whatever it is, represents about 2% of our activity. In my judgment, if we're transforming the future and we're painting pictures for the future, that should be moving up to 30 to 40% as we move. And that the savings that we would make whilst improving public services would be immense. But we won't be able to do that, we will not be able to do that, unless we take broadband as important as waste, as important as highways. It's part of our infrastructure in this country, and I don't think we've taken it until very recently that seriously. Now, Total Place. It's interesting when you go into the journey we've been on in Kent, because what it really is about is not just about whether or not we're sweating physical assets. We have about £5 billion worth of physical assets in the Kent economy, inclusive of central government. And if you're a Martian looking down at those physical assets and then you perceive them from the citizen's point of view rather than your individual organisational's point of view, it doesn't make sense. And we've heard Edward's comments about some parts of the country that are on that journey too, and it's very salutary. And so we've done that, we've looked at that. And the thing that you come to one central conclusion is that the structures, the functional structures we have in local government, certainly the structures we have in the spending departments of central government, do not easily lend themselves to creating a world that is citizen-centric and where we manage our physical and what I call professional assets fundamentally differently. They don't easily lend themselves. We get very tucked away on sovereignty, we get tucked away on who's controlling what. I'll give you a simple example of that in Kent. We've got, you'll hear this afternoon about building schools for the future. It was interesting to see the specification of building schools for the future not allowing us to have flexibility to put a whole range of community services in those schools, unless we paid more. Every time we moved, we had to pay more. And I was very upset about that, so we should have, who did that spec? And of course it was nationally driven, that spec, and we should have sorted that out. I think we are trying to sort it out now, you'll hear about that later. But it's very interesting, 600 schools I have in Kent. Now the question is, you will hear all over the country, the school that never sleeps. What is that really about? Because it is about total place. It's saying that after 4 o'clock in the afternoon, those facilities should be community facilities open to everyone. They should be sweated 24 hours a day, 52 weeks a year. And they shouldn't be even named as schools. They are becoming community resources. But what happens? We've got this sort of fragmented approach in the UK. They're owned by governors. They're ours. They're not yours. And it's a nonsense. Here we are, it's a nonsense. I put a proposal as part of Total Place in Kent that we get the private sector. Just to remind you, just Kent County Council alone has a 2.2 billion turnover a year. Out of that, 300 million is staff. 700 million a year is in the private sector and the third sector. 700 million a year. So I suggested we create a commercial vehicle in Kent that takes over those schools at 4 in the afternoon, all of them. And that commercial vehicle manages those assets on the community's behalf and sweats those assets totally differently to the way we have at the moment. We only have about 3% of our schools that, in my view, are sweating those assets appropriately. Now that crashes right into the governor structures, it crashes into all the political nuances about how you do that, and that's what Total Place is starting to do. It's starting to ask unthinkable questions and taking us all of our comfort zones, whether we're politicians or professionals, because the silos that we still work in the public sector are very powerful. In my view, since we restructured our functions a few years ago, we've even become more siloed. They just happen to be multidisciplinary silos now. They're not actually citizens' silos. They're not seeing the world from the citizens' point of view, they're seeing it from organisational points of view. And I take Edward's point. I think that leadership and management over the next 5 to 10 years in public services has got to be what I call lateral rather than vertical. It's got to see the world totally different and start to become much more powerfully citizen-centric. Whether we're in the private sector or whether we're in the public sector, our obsession should be the customer. And once you start from that position, and we did in Kent, you start to ask the unthinkable questions. And it's no good anymore saying, Kent County Council, I said to my leader the other day, well, yeah, we're a great authority, you could say we're 4-star authority, not good enough. The future is not about whether we are efficient. The issue is whether globally, as a public sector family, we're efficient and we're sweating our global assets differently. And that requires, in my view, fundamentally different relationship, but particularly between local government and central government. It requires a fundamental difference in our relationship between these big players, these big spending departments, who even now are saying they're not sure they want to play with Total Place. I had a permanent secretary the other, well, we're not sure we want to do that yet. Smelling the coffee, right? Is it going to require serious political leadership in a hung parliament that forces the big spending departments? Because what I would love to see is a root and branch change, a revolution, and get a local government, particularly the unitaries and the county government sub-regionally, to take back responsibility that they had over 100 years ago. Take it back from government. And say to government, we'll do this for you with our private sector partners. You know, you become concerned with what you're good at. Greatest respect, if you take modernisation, local government has transformed itself over the last 20 years.